Hey there, Agile turkeys and Agile stuffing with maybe a little Agile cranberry sauce on the side, and welcome to another episode of Agile Bites, a podcast sponsored by Integrity Inspired Solutions, where we're building software in an agile manner day in and day out. Today's episode deals with a question: when should you use Scrum? Those of you that have listened to the podcast for a while now will probably recognize a lot of this material. You might even be able to piece a lot of it together from past podcasts. In fact, not very long ago, I did an episode on whether or not Scrum was a good framework for a beginning team, a team newer to Agile, and explored that. And some similar ground is going to be covered here. But I wanted to take this question as a specific focus to give specific advice to a specific group of people. Because I find that as I have these greater conversations with other people who are interested in Agile, teams that are trying to do Agile, and people, all the way from management down to the developers themselves who are curious about this, Scrum is kind of a default. It's the Kleenex of Agile frameworks, methodologies, and strategies, right? When people say, hey, we need to increase our agility or do more Agile software development, they almost automatically pick up Scrum. And, kudos to the Scrum folks for marketing. That is an impressive achievement. But the problem with that is that very rarely do people ask the question, is Scrum the right thing for us to be doing? It's just kind of assumed that it is, right? We want to be Agile. Scrum does that for you, so let's do it. But the problem is that Scrum was actually not designed to be a generic software development framework or a generic product development framework that is intended to be used by all kinds of software development teams in all kinds of applications and contexts. And when I start talking to people about this begins to engender some curiosity, because a lot of people have never really even stopped to question this, to think like, well, is what we're doing really a good fit for Scrum, and vice versa, I suppose. And so what happens is you have people and they start doing Scrum. Scrum is painful and difficult. And then Agile coaches or consultants trying to be helpful will say, well, this is what Scrum is supposed to do. The reason it's painful and difficult is because Scrum is exposing issues with the way that you work or the way that you manage or whatever that you can finally start to improve. So Scrum is doing its job. It's supposed to hurt. There is a bit of truth to that, right? Whenever you begin to adopt ways of working that are fighting against your normal culture and values and assumptions, it is painful and it is difficult. And a lot of times it is surfacing those values and assumptions that are holding you back, right? From being agile and responsive and that sort of thing. So that does happen. And please don't hear me discounting that. But Scrum might also be difficult and it might hurt because the kind of software you're building just isn't right for it. And it's not the right choice for you. And if your assumption is that Scrum is just kind of the default, like we should all just start there, well, then that would have never occurred to you, right? So that's what I want to talk about today and give you some things to think about. Instead of just adopting Scrum because Scrum exists and people like it, I want you to really think about your product development, the kind of projects you have going on, and whether Scrum is your ideal fit for that. So I want to start by talking about a quote from the Scrum Guide itself. When the Scrum Guide is talking about what Scrum is, it says the following: Scrum is a lightweight framework that helps people, teams, and organizations generate value through adaptive solutions for complex problems. And the key word that I want to unpack from that statement is the word complex, because the way we use just natural language, complex can mean a lot of different things. A lot of times we mean something that's complicated. We think about like machinery and like a watch or machinery. We think about jets, right? We think about big pieces of machinery, things that have a lot of moving parts, a lot of precision instrumentation. And we say, wow, those systems are really complex. And what we mean by that is that it's complicated, right? There's just a lot going on. There's a lot of moving parts and it all has to go right. But when the Scrum Guide says that Scrum is for complex problems, it doesn't mean difficult problems or multifaceted problems or complicated problems. Complex here does not mean complicated. It has a sense that comes from something called the Coffin framework, which talks about different domains of problems, ranging all the way from chaotic to complex And complicated is a separate domain as well. But the complex domain is the domain that represents problems where you have unknown unknowns. Okay? There's things that you don't know and you aren't sure what all of them are. Cause and effect can only be deduced in retrospect. In other words, you have to see what happens before you can know what's going to happen. And there are no right answers. Okay? There are just different ways to try to see what happens. When we're in that situation, then we are close to what is known as a complex problem or a complex domain. We don't know what the right way forward is. All we can kind of do is put something out there, see what happens, learn from that, and then modify our future steps accordingly. So in complex problems, we are proceeding very tentatively. We are mapping out very little of our future actions because we don't know what the best future actions are going to be until we start putting things out there and seeing what happens. And that's what sort of helps us navigate our way. It's like building a pier as we are walking out on the pier, right? Or we've all heard the joke, building the plane as we're flying it, right? It's for those kinds of problems where there's so much we don't know. It's knowable. Okay, we can find the answers. It's not chaotic. It's not where cause and effect don't apply and there's no way to know the unknowns. But we just don't know what they are. We don't know what we're going to find out, and we need to figure it out as we go, and that will dictate our actions. Those are characteristics of a complex problem. So let me give you an example in software development. Let's say I'm building a product in a very competitive market. Maybe other products like mine exist, right? So let's say I'm building like personal finance software, okay? And, there's already well-established software in this space, right? QuickBooks, there's Mint. I don't know if Microsoft Money is still a thing, but, it was a good product in this space as well. So the space may be well known, but we don't know what we can do for people to buy our product. Why would anyone buy ours, right? We might have disruptive ideas. Well, these other products don't do X and ours does X, and people are going to love it, right? Or the UX of personal finance products is terrible. Ours is going to be amazing. It's a dream to use. People are going to love it. They're going to meet their goals. It's going to make them feel good. So you have these ideas maybe of why you think you ought to put a product in this space and what people are going to buy, but you don't know. You don't know what people are going to want for sure, and you don't know how they're going to respond to what you do. So instead of knowing what you need to do to sell the software, you have to find out after the fact. You have to perform an action, see what happens, and then use that to fill in your unknowns, like a science experiment. You may have a hypothesis, but you don't know. And so, we might put out our personal finance software, and we might put out a few of the innovative features that we think people are going to go nuts over, and then we see what happens. What kind of feedback do we get? Are people interested in buying it? Are they buying it? If it's software as a service, are they signing up? If we are not getting good feedback, then we are kind of back to square one, right? We have to try different features or maybe pivot our idea altogether. Maybe we shouldn't even be building personal finance software. It's a crowded market. But that would be an example of a complex problem. We might know what personal finance is all about, but we don't know what we should put in the product to get people to buy it. We don't know. We can guess, but it's only after the fact can we realize it. So that would be an example of complex software. Now, it's usually at this point that people say, well, but all software has unknowns. And that's true, right? That is a big lesson that the craft of software development has learned over the years, and is one of the reasons why you don't find a whole lot of traditional project management still ruling the day when it comes to knowledge work and software projects, because we have figured out that every software project has a quantity of unknown unknowns. And there's a limit to how much effort and money and time we should invest in trying to eliminate our unknowns without trying something. So we know this is the case with every initiative. But even though this is an ingredient in almost all software, that ingredient does not occupy the same space or severity in all projects. And I think we have to kind of be honest with ourselves about that, because a lot of times in trying to help, especially traditional management, understand knowledge work, we really beat the drum hard that software development, it's not like building a house. It's not like manufacturing. It's not like any of these things. And because we really want them to kind of let go of some of the more traditional deterministic ways of thinking about our work, which is good. But sometimes, man, we can back so far away from that cliff that we fall backwards off the other side of the mountain, right? And we make it sound like anything we do in software is completely non-deterministic. There's just no way to know anything. There's no way to plan for anything. It's just all, we'll just have to build stuff and just kind of see what happens. And it's just all, completely unknown and unknowable until we do things. The truth is that every software product that we build is somewhere along that continuum, right? Some of them have a high degree of that. There's a lot about this that we really don't know. We've never done this before. We don't know what the market's going to accept. We don't know if our business is going to look the same in 6 months. We don't know if this piece of legislation is going to get passed by Congress. That's totally going to change the landscape. It's just a highly volatile, exploratory environment, and we just don't really know what to build. That's sort of one end of the spectrum. Then on the other end of the spectrum, we have applications like when we built the chain pull force equation application. Like physics is just not going to change that much. Like when you innovate in physics, then you get put on magazine covers and things like that, right? We just need to build software where people can type in some numbers and calculate chain pull, right? It's not volatile. It is not a competitive market. It is not a breeding ground for innovation or rapidly changing market conditions. It's just a physical equation, right? And so, yeah, are there some unknowns with a software project like that? If you're building software to help a team do chain pull force equations, yeah, there's a few, but not a lot. You kind of know what you need to build, and you kind of understand the area, and you kind of know when you'll be successful or not. And you know a lot of that in advance, like you know a lot of it without having to try new things. So that would be an example. Or let's say maybe what's a more common example is, let's say I'm building an internal line of business application that operates off of well-known business rules. Let's say I'm building an application for an insurance company, and it's property and casualty insurance, and they need to be able to generate a quote based on how somebody answers certain questions and financial information and things like that. And the business rules for this are very well established, right? Given these answers and this data, this is the quote that we're going to produce, 95% of the time. And this is an internal application, right? We're not trying to sell this on the open market. We're not competing with other products. We're building our own thing for our own teams to use. Are there unknowns in that project? Yeah, sure, of course. With any software project you build for other people, until people see something, they're not really going to know in advance exactly how it needs to go. So sure, we'll probably be changing some screen designs around. There's probably going to be some requirements where somebody forgot about some fields or some pieces of functionality. Somebody will have forgotten some of the business rules, or maybe one person told us one set of business rules and another person told us another, and we have to figure that out. Yeah, there's unknowns, there's uncertainty. Maybe we've never built insurance software before, so we're not really sure what the level of effort is going to look like as we think about the product. These are things that are common to all software projects. The reality is that this project is not really that unknown. It's not really that ambiguous. We have a generally pretty good idea of what we're going to build, and we generally have a pretty good idea of what the reception is going to be if we build software that executes these things successfully. Yes, some unknowns, but the unknowns are pretty low. So think about those as two examples. On the one hand, we've got a product where we're competing in the open market, and we got to innovate. We got to do something our competitors are not doing that the market is going to love. On the other side of the fence, we have a product that we've built internally for a well-known team with well-known business rules that they can articulate, and we have a pretty good idea of what the software needs to do to be successful, and we have a pretty good idea that people will adopt it and that we'll be successful with it even before we start. If you are closer to the first example, Scrum is more valuable. If you are closer to the second example, Scrum is less valuable, because Scrum was designed for that first scenario. It was designed for complex problems where we are just surrounded by a field where we don't know what we don't know. And the only way to find out is to take a shot at it and see what happens. That environment is where Scrum is meant to be. If you are not in an environment like that, or you are somewhat distant from an environment like that, Scrum may not be your best choice. You may be incurring accountabilities and events and artifacts and, generally speaking, overhead that you really don't need. They aren't going to do what they need to do in your environment, because Scrum was designed for learning through tentative exploration. It was not designed to give you a good way to build a product where you know a lot of what you need to know to build it. Scrum is great in those environments where you don't know a lot of what you need to build it. You need outside feedback and stimulus to tell you. I think it's illustrative to think briefly on the history of Scrum, because Scrum came from a paper called the New Product Development Game. And if you haven't read it, you should. It is freely available on the internet. Harvard Business Review. And the New Product Development Game is where Scrum pulls all of its metaphors. Scrum is, in many cases, an adaptation of the practices described in the New Product Development Game for software. And in fact, in Ken Schwaber's original OOPSLA paper, he specifically credits the New Product Development Game for a lot of his principles and ideas about Scrum that he then applied to software development. But the New Product Development Game is about manufacturing. It covers industries that are building things like photocopiers and cameras, right? Markets where you have products that are already a very competitive market. So let's say I'm building a photocopier. I'm going to sell photocopiers. So I'm competing with Xerox and other people who make photocopiers. You know, photocopiers, there's a lot of them out there, right? So why will people buy my photocopier? Well, I have to have an edge, right? I have to have an innovation or a group of innovations, or I have to have a specific niche that I've customized the photocopier for. There's something I got to do with my photocopier so that people will buy it. But how will I know? How will I know that my idea is successful? I can't know it. I can't know it in advance. The only way to really know is to get it out there and see what the market response is. But in manufacturing, this is a big risk, right? Like, I am manufacturing physical products. It's not software where I can just change a few lines of code and now I got a new product. If I build a photocopier that has certain features built into it, like, that's it, right? I'm not going to be able to retool a ton of photocopiers that I'm manufacturing. So what do you do? What do you do in an environment like that? And the New Product Development Game was all about the practices and processes that companies who are in that space are adopting to economically and quickly innovate and control their risk while doing so. Well, what do you have to do if you're going to manufacture some photocopiers and see if people buy them? Well, you can't have these long siloed engineering practices. They have to overlap. And there has to be a lot of collaboration between the people involved, between design and production and all the different stages of design and production. Those can't happen in discrete siloed stages. They have to overlap with each other. People have to be talking back and forth. There has to be a lot of information traveling up and down the line so that design can quickly adapt and manufacturing can quickly respond. We have to really tool our feedback mechanisms. How are we going to know that this copier is going to be successful? And what are the quick ways we can find that out without building 5 million of them? What if we build 500 and then we see if those 500 sell in a limited market? What are the practices that we can do so that we can pivot quickly if it turns out that our idea about the photocopier or the camera or whatever is not right? The market's not going to buy it. How can I adjust to that quickly and economically and with low risk? This is what the New Product Development Game is all about. Scrum is an adaptation of that for software development. That's what it is. And so the closer your environment is to what I just described, then the better fit Scrum is going to be for you. The further away you are from that, then the more overhead you are incurring for no good reason. And you might look at Scrum and think, oh, well, here's a practice or two that I really like from it and I'll use it. I mean, we do that. Even our Kanban teams, do some Scrum practices that are useful. Or you might find that just good old XP is going to get you where you need to go, right? I mean, you have a lot of other options and Scrum might not be your best one because the product might not fit. So let me ask you, when it comes to your team and the product that you are building, are you figuring out the product as you go? Like, we don't really know what the right thing is to build here. We have to figure it out while we're building it. Or do you already have kind of a pretty good idea? And yeah, some things about it are probably going to change and you're going to have to modify some things here and there. there's some things that you don't know, but yeah, you got a pretty good idea of what you're building. Do you have a backlog that goes out for 3 months, 6 months? I mean, it kind of sounds like you've got a pretty good idea of what you're building, right? And then maybe Scrum is not the best fit for that. The other things to consider is that as you look at what your organization is producing, this level of unknowability can vary from product to product, right? Product A may be pretty well know, like you pretty know what you're going to build. You pretty well know how people are going to receive it if you build it right. But then you might have product B over here where you don't know what the right product is. And even if you build it right, you don't know how your users are going to receive it. And you don't know how the market's going to react. You might be the same organization with two very different kinds of product contexts. And in one context, Scrum might be really helpful, but in the other context, it won't be. So don't make both your teams do Scrum because it's not going to be as helpful in one of those situations. It is also possible that a product may start out being complex and become less so over time, right? So in the beginning, we might not even know what features really ought to go into this product to really sell it. But after the product has been around a couple of years, well, now our unknowns are much lower, right? Maybe it's a specific feature and we don't know how the market's going to react or something like that. So maybe we don't really need Scrum as a holistic product development framework for this product anymore, or it's a lot less useful because the level of unknown unknowns has just decreased so substantially over time. So you need to feel free to start a product with Scrum and then decide that Scrum has kind of served its purpose, right? It's just sort of outlived its usefulness. We are not probing and sensing and adapting at the high rate that we used to. And so we just don't really need Scrum to do that anymore. So think about that as you think about your products. How unknown is it? And if you have a pretty good idea of what you're building and you have a pretty good idea of how people will receive it, if you do it right, maybe Scrum is less valuable for you. But if you are in an environment where you really don't know what you're going to build and you're just going to have to do these experiments and see what happens, and that's how you're going to figure out what right looks like, Scrum becomes a lot more helpful. So think about the product you're building as you're making a decision as to whether or not to use Scrum. Thanks everyone for listening to Agile Bites. Agile does sometimes bite, but we don't think it always has to. If you enjoyed what you heard today, don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you happen to be using. And if you can, leave us a comment because we'd love to hear your feedback. What things would you like to hear about? What things did you hear that were valuable to you today? You can also head over to integrityinspired.com to sign up to our email list. But that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next time.